Okay, so right off the bat, it's important to point out that we're starting off with a bit of a loaded question here. When we ask, what did the Romans think about race, we're doing so based on our own modern framing of that term. Today, race generally gets equated to one's physical appearance, and in particular, skin color. Humans have always had ways of distinguishing in versus out groups, and it just so happens that our own has its seeds in the 16th to 18th centuries with the age of exploration, the conquest of the New World, and the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. It's during this era that the idea of race evolved to meet the dynamics of the times. Rapid developments in economics, politics, and science during the 1800s also played a particularly large role in further developing a new framework of race with which to understand the world. It's a complicated subject definitely worth exploring, but not one we have time to get into right now, other than to say that the idea of race we have today is a product of this recent shift. So what came before? Well, as I already said, humans have always had a way to identify in versus out groups. Humans have also long had observable physical differences for thousands of years, which our ancestors were certainly not blind to. It's just that in the past, people had to rely on a more broad range of indicators for how to group individuals. Rather than the physical, this ended up being the cultural. So basically something more equivalent to our own idea of ethnicity. If you asked a Roman to guess someone's race, they would have a lot to consider. Who are their ancestors? What language do they speak? How do they dress? What are their mannerisms? Based on these answers, your average Roman could then slot them into different racial categories. Ah, this person is Greek, or Carthaginian, Gallic, German, Iberian, Egyptian, and so on. Each of these had their own set of expected cultural stereotypes, which could be both positive and negative. While it's impossible to discern how prevalent these ideas were amongst the general public, we can at least get an idea by looking at some surviving texts. Julius Caesar, for instance, described the Gauls as being superstitious, independent, lazy, and prone to violence. The Carthaginians, meanwhile, were said to be clever but devious. Tacitus has a lot to say about these groups. Of the Germans, he writes, quote, "They can exert their strength only by means of violent effort. They are less able to endure toil or fatiguing tasks and cannot bear thirst or heat, though their climate has inured them to cold spells and the poverty of their soil to hunger." He goes on to describe much more about their stereotypical culture, including their admirable monogamy and pure, simple living. However, it's important to take such descriptions with a grain of salt, as the author is setting them up as a rhetorical device to contrast against the decline of Roman morals as he perceived them. Another important thing to note here is that Roman writers saw all outsider groups as alien. The pale-skinned Hibernian from the far north was no more bizarre than the dark-skinned Ethiopian from the far south, or the Indian from the distant east. All were lumped together as exotic and considered to have odd or mystical customs.